So I thought we'd just kick off. Maybe Chris, if you could just tell us a little bit about how you got started with. I think everyone knows. Anyone who writes CSS knows about CSS tricks. Everyone who does some front end work uses CodePen. Maybe you could just tell us a little bit to get started on how those got going and how you kind of turned them into going concerns, because I think that's really interesting to all of us.
Sure. So it sounds like you know about those things, so that's cool. But CSS-tricks is probably the oldest of the projects that I work on. CSS-tricks.com, terribly cheesy name for a site, and it's largely just a blog. We publish articles on that site, a handful of times a day, 1, 2, 3, 4 kind of thing. And these days I have kind of an editor help me with that, with a kind of a publishing schedule. And there's a number of guest writers and staff writers and stuff, but it's a pretty small operation. In fact, nobody on it is full-time, it's just me really, and I'm not even full-time on it. So it's kind of just like in a sense, a community ran site for content that's, it seems like it would be just about CSS, but it's been a long time since that's been the case. It's largely just about anything about building websites with a front end tilt to it, because that's my expertise, So we might get a guest post proposal. And in fact, anybody here, I'm sure, is capable of writing a guest post for CSS-tricks. We're always looking for people to write about something that they're interested in and have worked with recently. I love that stuff. That's something about, I don't know, Ruby on Rails development or something. And I'd probably just be like, no, I mean, as much as I do some of that myself, it's not really like in the realm of what we talk about on CSS-tricks, but that's what CSS-tricks is, and it's really grown. I have an open tab in my browser that's of a blog post named the 13th 4th, because the 4th of July happened to be the day that CSS-tricks launched 13 years ago now. So it's just about 13 years old, which is, I don't know, it's pretty old in web terms, and not, certainly not as old as a lot of stuff out there. It didn't feel like I was doing anything in the early days when I started it. There was plenty of blogs and stuff like that. But it's, now it's starting to feel like it's a mature website for sure. It's got a, certain audience is built up to it, and SEO has built up over the years. So the point of CSS-tricks is just we write articles about how to do something, or some kind of general news about front end, generally web development. So there's thousands of articles on the site, and videos and little snippets and an almanac of things. So if you're trying to figure out how border radius works or forget the syntax of it, that's available on CSS-tricks. So that's that. Yeah.
It's a really fantastic resource. And I mean, thank you for giving it to us over all these years. I think all of us have learned so much from CSS-tricks. I remember when the Flexbox and Grid became things, those were kind of the two go-to references were on CSS-tricks. And it's something that we've all utilized.
Pretty well for us too. It's one of those things where you kind of, how can we repeat that success? What else can we deliver that's in that kind of vein, and that's tough to do. There's not that many different CSS features that need that kind of treatment. Okay, so that exists, largely just a blog. It's a WordPress site. It doesn't do anything terribly fancy. There's some custom code in there from over the years, but it's not that much technology behind CSS-tricks, and it's certainly not a super new stack of technology. But that's okay. If I needed those new things, I'd put them in there. What I like about it is that I really have a strong handle on how it all works, and I'm comfortable developing for it and making things happen in there. It just feels kind of comfortable development, which is a good place to be. It's also a business, though. I do, like you did, I get thanked for the site a lot, and I really appreciate that. That's cool. I'm happy to be thanked for work that I do, but it is also a business, It's like, to some degree, you can like thank the grocery store for existing, but it's not, they're not altruistic. They're not giving you free groceries, on CSS-tricks is a business too. So I sell advertising on it and sponsorship, and lately I'm even selling memberships to it, where you can like read a kind of quote unquote book that's a part of it. That grid and flexbox guide we have posters for now that you can buy and pin up on your wall if you want. That's a new thing we're doing. So it's a business too. It's like we write and give away content. We'll never stop doing that, but it operates as a business too, which is I'm proud of that too. That the fact that I invented this thing and kind of can support me and my family based on this website, which I think is cool. And it's only a part of what I do. There's a lot of demos on CSS-tricks, like a ton of them. I'd say almost most articles have some code demo of some kind. And it's one thing to show a code block, and we still do that too, because conceptually when you're reading an article, sometimes it's like, we're talking about this piece of code, and you just look at the code and that's enough. But a lot of times it's nice not to just see the code, but see it kind of execute in context. So in the probably most of CSS-tricks life, the way that I did demos was I would just handwrite them on my computer in an HTML file and a CSS file, and I'd kind of SFTP them up to a directory on CSS-tricks, an examples folder, and I would link to that and be like, do you want to see this in action? Go to this URL. And over the years, I'm like, well, I should evolve that. I should put analytics on those so I can see if people are visiting them. And there should be a way in any given demo to get back to the site. So maybe I'll have a custom header bar on the demos and a footer for the analytics. So I'll use PHP so I could do include statements to get those going. That's cool. But, even then, that was kind of a workable system, but it wasn't. It was kind of a pain in the butt to maintain, and it wasn't kind of all it could be. And at some point, these kind of coding websites started to come around. The two I thought of in those early days was JS Fiddle and JS Bin. Those are still around and going just fine. They kind of invented the concept of a web page that you could go to and just literally write HTML, CSS, and JavaScript and see what you're doing in real time. You press the run button and see, in the case of JS Fiddle or JS Bin, I think kind of auto updates. But I was like, that's tremendous. That's way better than me uploading an HTML file to go look at a demo. It's much nicer to see the code and the demo at the same time. And I was like, I got to get in on this. So there's a moment where I'm like, should I port over every demo I have on CSS-tricks over to like JS Bin or something, and then link people to that, because the experience is so much better. And not to mention they're easier to update. There's just more information and possibility in those worlds. But I was like, I don't have any control over those things. I can't. I'm worried. I don't know. Neither of them had a business model. Neither of them still do. To me, it's a little bit amazing that they're still around. In a way, a lot of businesses that don't make any money don't have a good track record of staying around. So I kind of saw it as an opportunity. In the very early days, I roped in some friends of mine who were kind of bored at work, to like, let's build a really simple version of something like JS Fiddle and open source it, and I'll use it at CSS-tricks. You're just helping me out. Like, I think this is a really good idea, but I just want to have a copy of it for myself so that I can run my demos off of it, and it doesn't need to be that fancy. And we built it, but we had they did that for me. It turned out to be a little more complicated than it seemed at first. And this is the early days of CodePen, if it's not clear what I'm talking about. It just was fun to build, and it was fun to add features to. But it turned out that it was really easiest to like run it on its own site. So that's kind of what we did, and we just came up with a name for it, and chucked it on a website. And then it kind of worked for me, but that means other people could use it too, and they could have accounts and stuff. And it was like, this is an app. This is a thing. And we were so interested in what people were doing with it that we built like an admin page that just showed us the most recent stuff that everybody was building. So we could always just sit on that admin page and just see what people were doing on the site. And it was like, this page is so cool. Why don't we make it the homepage of the site? And then we'll have the editor be kind of buried on a sub page. Not buried, but just you have to click over to get it, which is different kind of than the approach of the other one, which made it was kind of like a move where it's like, this is going to be a social site. So why don't we track the views of how often it's viewed? Why don't we put a little heart button there like Twitter's got for tweets, you know? And that's kind of fun. Why don't we add comment threads to the pen so people can talk to each other on them, you know? And all of a sudden there's these metrics, and then we're like, well, how could we sort the pens based on those metrics? You know, all this stuff was like little moments in time ticking forward to the point where like, this thing is cool. And they're like, well, you know, we're spending money on this server. Maybe we'll have a pro plan that you can pay for, and then you get a couple of features to see if this thing's got legs, you know. And some people signed up for it, and I was like, that's cool. I wonder if we could make them better. I wonder if we could add more pro features. I wonder, you know, this thing just kind of evolved to the point where at some point my friends were like, I think we can all quit our jobs and give this a go. Just give it a try, you know. Think of how much more we could do faster if we all weren't working full time. We could work on this full time. And so we kind of took that leap, and, you know, some people are interested in that moment. And it was interesting is I had CSS-tricks. So I was there was some income coming in from that anyway. So that wasn't super risky for me. I could always do something else. We could all go back to work if we needed to. And for the other guys, they just through virtue of working at startups and stuff, we worked at some startups that got bought. So they were kind of like, that was beneficial to them. And it was right at that moment where they're like, I can leave and have a little padding, so it's not dangerous to me to do that. So we weren't the kind of entrepreneurs that, you know, put our own home up for mortgage or second mortgage or whatever to fund the startup. It was a little more cushy than that, I'm afraid, yeah. But we did it anyway. And so, you know, many years later now, we're kind of doing the same thing. Yeah. How can we make the pro plans more valuable? What kind of cool features can we build? And it's grown up to the point where now we've hired a few developers, and we're still a very small team, but making it happen. CodePen's 8 years old now, so it all worked out pretty well.
That's great. Thank you. So we've got quite a few questions coming in the chat. We'll just run through them from the top, if that's okay with everyone. So there's a question from Boats around CSS. That's come a long way since version 1. And you've kind of watched it mature along the way, like those of us, like some of us as well. And, you know, are you happy with where we're at with CSS? Do you think it's at a good point at the moment? Perhaps a more open-ended question. Is there anything you would change about CSS if you could?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know about CSS1. That was before my time, but I remember 2 because I remember 3. You know, 3 was such a big deal, such a kind of like a marketing moment for CSS, to the point that still you'll hear people just blurt out CSS3 just almost like on accident. That's just what they think of CSS is. But it was funny when that was a big moment for CSS, because you could do a bunch of stuff that was really hard otherwise. We got even like border radius is a CSS3 thing, which people don't think of as a fancy CSS feature, but there was a time when it was. But it also gave us stuff like transforms and animations and transitions and that kind of thing, which is a big deal for CSS. So it was tremendously like a powerful thing. And then, you move forward in CSS a little bit, and now we have things like Flexbox and Grid. Those were transformative for CSS. You know, CSS started not to become such a pain in the butt, such a source of like really confusing. I mean, people still think CSS is confusing. You just see what it was like back then. It was much more confusing. It was much more steeped in, I'm going to try this in one browser, and then I absolutely have to try it in other browsers to make sure that it's not just a complete mess, you know, particularly Internet Explorer, lived through those days of making sure things worked in that. These days, I don't do that much. Like there's still cross-browser problems. It's not like those days are gone. They probably never will be. But for the most part, if you write some CSS and ship it in, it's you're not doing anything terribly fancy, it'll probably be fine.
Yeah.
Which that's a big deal for the world of HTML and CSS and JavaScript too. It's the cross-browser stories, and that was literally a war. They called it the browser wars. That was a war that had to be fought to say, browsers, you really need to get along. All your stuff needs to be done the same way, and you can compete elsewhere. Do not compete on like we have this feature and you don't, because that's bad for the web. And somehow that war was won. And the browsers agreed that's a good idea. And now they kind of, marketing for browsers is, look at how well we support this standard. Look at how compliant we are. We're more compliant than you are, which is so cool. But that's something we kind of have to watch for as developers. If you see a browser starting to go rogue and ship features that are outside of the standards process, it's kind of like our job as developers to be like, you better not. Anyway, so now CSS is, it's continuing to evolve, and it's been much faster. Like the velocity in which we see new features and then like not only see it, but then get to the point where you actually get to use it is, it feels 10 times as fast as it used to be. Sometimes you'd hear about a new CSS feature and you wouldn't even consider being able to use it for ages. It's just an intellectual exercise. Now, the moment you hear about a feature to the point that you're able to use it is pretty quick. And that has to do with the idea of evergreen browsers and the idea that when new browser versions ship, people don't have to download it and install it. When that was the case, nobody would do it. Of course they wouldn't. Their browser works just fine. Why would you download a new version of it? Now the new versions just arrive. Quit your browser, start it up again, you got the new version. And that's true across all of the major browsers now, which is a darn big deal, which means that the browsers are evolving much faster. So we're getting to this point where you can kind of teach and understand CSS, and it feels very logical. Like you can, as somebody who once in a while has to teach somebody from scratch about CSS, it feels like I'm teaching you a system that is very coherent in a way that it hasn't been in the past. So that's probably the most exciting thing about CSS, is that it's like, all this stuff generally makes sense. I want a column. I want to put a background on the column. I want to move the column over here. Works great.
Kind of a related question. What are the kind of things you're looking forward to or excited about, that's on the horizon in Frontend, do you think? Specifically around CSS, JavaScript, HTML. HTML seems to not change much. There hasn't really been anything new in HTML for a long time. Do you think there's anything interesting around there, or do we need new things in HTML?
Yeah, well, I don't know. Probably. Some standardization would be good to some degree. The thing that gets talked about most recently right now is like form controls, and like what can we do with form controls, which is an HTML problem as well as a CSS problem. For example, you have input type equals date or something in the browser, and it's a neat feature. Like you typed that one line of code, and now when it renders in the browser, you click into it and you get a calendar, and you can pick a date from a calendar. That's really outstanding that you can write one line of code and get that much value out of it. And then to look around the web and be like, nobody uses that. That's, and they don't use it because, I don't know, they need a UI that matches their website a little better, or it has some missing feature that they can't use. That's unfortunate. So that's the moment where the spec people need to get involved and be like, what are the problems then? Can we get you using this? Because when you don't use it, it causes all kinds of problems. When you rewrite a calendar widget from scratch, you're adding this, this pile of CSS and JavaScript to the site that slows down the web. The chances of your implementation being as good as their implementation, even if you need a little feature, you're probably going to add that feature and break another one. That's kind of the reality of it. You know, like, are you going to make it actually accessible for people? That's probably the number one thing that you won't do in general. And I'm not talking about any one of you. I'm just talking about anybody in the world. You make a calendar widget, the chances of you making it perfectly accessible are really low. That's so that the idea of like just letting the browser do it is just better for speed and accessibility and consistency, and it's just better. So, but in order to get people using it, they have to do a good job too. So that's interesting. But yeah, HTML needs to evolve. It's just in a stagnant kind of state, and it's the lowest level thing. So it's less possible to iterate on. You know, JavaScript is just so much more powerful than HTML is, and so it can kind of like polyfill itself in a way that HTML just can't do. You know, you can't just invent some HTML that polyfills itself. It's just not a thing that you do.
I think something that regularly pops up is, you know, why don't we have tabs in the browser?
Sure.
And another thing that's been coming up recently is around the details element and implementations across browsers, where it works here, but it doesn't work there, and it has this bug here and that bug there, and so on, where it looks like browser makers are very up to date, as you mentioned earlier, with CSS, and obviously a lot of, you know, modern JavaScript support, but lagging a little bit in this area.
Yeah. Well, that's the best. That's a great way to put it. It's like, look at the most popular design patterns and make sure that we have HTML elements that match those design patterns, or give us some other native abstraction to do it. So tabs is an awesome example, because it's, you know, which tab is active, it depends on which content is being shown. Is there a world in which you could express that in HTML? Or, you know, when you put the great minds of the internet at it, is there another way to deliver that capability without having to have necessarily a tabs element? That could be some kind of like state management in CSS, which has long been lagged. I'm sure some people in here are aware of, have used the checkbox hack, which is this idea that an HTML element can have a checked or not state. That state, you need the on or off, but you're faking it through a selector in HTML. So maybe there's another way to express state, and if we had that, we'd use that for tabs. So that way it'd be like BYO, bring your own HTML, and use the state management stuff in CSS to handle the tabs part.
Right.
Maybe, you know. But modals is a good example. We got that in HTML, and nobody uses it because it's problematic in a bunch of ways. So if anything, like, I'd like to see new stuff, but I'd also like to see the good ideas that are already there get cleaned up. You know, the details is also a fascinating one. The only reason we're starting to use it more and more is because we you know, the IE dies more every day, and Edge has gone Chromium. Edge notably didn't support it, but now that Edge is Chromium, it does support it. So that's a big slice of the pie of browser support that we just got kind of overnight. So now it just feels a lot safer to use details and summary really quickly. It was like 2 weeks ago we couldn't use it, and now we can. You know.
Yeah, there's some quirks around that as well. I mean, just as an aside, I recently discovered that Safari will not honor display flex on the summary element in details.
Great. Cool. You know, super neat.
I mean, there are ways around it, of course, but it's, you know, without these kinds of you know, uniform implementations, our CSS suffers a little bit.
It does. And you know, I know a big one about the summary too is that the summary has an ARIA role on it that just wipes out all other ARIA roles within the summary. So if you're hoping to have a expandable section that had an H3 header in it, and you'd expect that H3 to represent itself as an H3 to assistive technology, it's like, too bad it doesn't. It represents as a summary because it's in a summary. And that's a little too bad. It's not something that has to be like that forever. You know, it needs to be agreed on how it should behave, spec'd how it should behave, and then roll out to browsers how it should behave. Now that dance is something else. That's a complicated thing, and I'm glad that people do that work, but I've never been involved in that. I just write blog posts, be like, this would be nice, and then kind of sit back and cross my fingers that it gets better someday, you know.
something quite topical. Every now and then, Twitter kind of erupts in a firestorm of JS developers versus CS developers around thorny questions on CSS-in-JS. Do you have any thoughts around this? Do you have a preference? Do you think, separation of concerns in a very traditional way is something we need to follow very strictly? Or do you see use cases for CSS-in-JS? I think, a lot of people I'm just noticing who here in this chat are CSS-in-JS proponents. So I think it's a good, we'd like to hear your thoughts on it.
I have no particular problem with it. I'm definitely not somebody that's like, that's a bad idea and we're going to regret it forever. I think it's a perfectly nice idea because your component, if you're using it, your components are built in JavaScript anyway. They're not rendering on the page until JavaScript has executed and decided to render that thing to the DOM. And if the styling information is there when that happens, fine. I just don't, it means that there's less, it's just how you've preferred to manage that CSS. So I have no problem with that whatsoever. Also, there's almost some performance benefit to it in that if you can skip or minimize the amount of CSS that's loaded kind of like traditionally in the head of your page, that's a blocking resource. So if it's not there, it just speeds up the rest of your page's opportunity to go. So I see lots of advantages there. The other advantage is that the bigger one to me is like the kind of the mental model of it all, and that like I'm writing styles that I know are attached to this component and they just stay there. And they're not going to affect anything else on the page, and it just makes me feel safer. And that's nice, even when you're alone working on a project. I think that's kind of nice, and it's especially nice when you're onboarding new developers, or they're hopping into an app that maybe they're not super familiar with, haven't wrapped their mind around entirely. That they can feel like they can write, they know where the CSS goes, and they know that it's tied right to that thing. I think that is empowering to them. I think that's kind of a big deal, because generally I think the idea of component-driven front ends is strong. I think that's like a big deal. That's kind of has driven the popularity of a lot of these frameworks. Is not the technology itself, but just the idea that I'm building front ends based on these components that are, they're small and they're nested in this one and they're bigger. Like the mental model of that, I think developers are like, they get it, and they like it, and they're doing it. And I agree. I think JavaScript has driven that world. It's not the only way to build a website, but for a lot of websites, it makes a heck of a lot of sense. And we're seeing the web platform like agree to, and being like, oh, okay, components is a good idea. Maybe we'll get on board too. And hence the idea of web components, which is the native browser's version of trying to bring componentry to the regular web, so you don't need any JavaScript libraries. And that's a lot. I think that's a source of some of this Twitter snarkery that you see, is that effort from browsers is like, not everybody agrees was a good idea, or that they did a particularly good job, or there's a million things to talk about there. But I think that's where that drama comes from. Right. But CSS-in-JS itself, it seems a little like closed-minded to be like, nope, only regular CSS will do, But at the same time, if you're like, nope, only CSS-in-JS will do, that's just as closed-minded. It's not as interesting either. I really, I don't always mean to be in the middle on every issue, but I am in this particular case, because I think a particularly powerful way to write CSS is to know if you're writing CSS that is intended to be globally distributed on this page. When I'm setting up my typography for a site, I'm not doing that on a component by component basis. I'm doing that on a site level basis. I'm saying headers on this website are in this particular font, and they're of this particular size, and all that. I'm using the cascade to my advantage. I'm setting that whole thing up. I might be setting up the layout for the whole page at a pretty global level. So that CSS can just be regular CSS. I don't need to set that at a component level necessarily, unless 100% of the website is is powered by JavaScript anyway, and there's a site wrapper component, and those things get set on the site wrapper component, something like that. But you kind of know what you're doing. In my world, I have generally global CSS, and then I like the CSS-in-JS approach for styling individual components with as much reusability as possible. For example, on CodePen, we have global CSS, and we use CSS modules for the styling of the individual components, which to me feels really comfortable. It's not as like fancy as emotion or styled components or anything, but they're files with, like, for us it's a .scss extension, so we can use Sass in them too, which feels like a weird mixing of worlds. But I like that because it gives us access to our global mix-ins and our global color definitions and things like that in a kind of CSS comfortable way. So it's just, to me it's like this: we're getting the power of CSS and JS and Sass and just writing regular CSS. It's like we get all of it from this tech choice, and on this particular code base, feels good.
Okay, I'm gonna just Skulk, do you want to take over a few questions?
Yeah, sure. Sorry, my mic was muted there for a second. So there's a couple of great questions here. Like, some of them I can probably answer because, for example, one of them being like, where do you go if you want to learn or level up your CSS in 2020? And I think, Chris, you actually, I saw a pretty recent article on that on CSS-tricks that actually deals with this. And it's pretty comprehensive as well. So I'll actually share a link to that. But so another question is, Chris, what is your feeling around AMP, and specifically in 2020? It's been around now for a while. Like, what is your feeling around where it's heading?
Yeah, okay. So just to define it, AMP is, I've never like hand built an AMP site, so I've a little bit limited knowledge here. It's not like super firsthand, nor have I been at an organization that has had like deep conversations about whether we're going to support this or not or what. But it's definitely like a Google-backed technology, and you have to really deliver a site from scratch with AMP. So like the doc type starting in the HTML is different in AMP. And you can't just use an IMG element. It's like not allowed. You have to use an AMP IMG element to display images. And lots of JavaScript is just not allowed. There's a real subset of stuff. And the whole point of all this, of like re-architecting this site or a version of your site in that technology, is speed. The whole point is, if we really limit what you're able to do here, you basically can't make a slow site. It's like this technology that's like, it's like pretty much impossible to make it slow. Now, I think that's been refuted. Like there's ways to make a slow site no matter what, but it's really helping you get us kind of a smoking fast site, but then, yeah, it's not, you can't just do it overnight. The bigger the site, the more kind of trouble you're going to have kind of making a site that's completely compliant with AMP. And I don't think 50% is enough. That's not acceptable for AMP. It's either AMP or it's not. You have to get all the way there or not do it at all. And so some tech just does it automatically for you. For example, I know on WordPress.com, if you build your site there, whatever you do, it doesn't matter. It'll figure out a way to make 100% AMP compatible version of your site. But if you go to it, because it's automated, your site won't look anything like your site. It'll just look like the styling of it is just super generic, and it'll just look like every other site on WordPress.com that's the AMP version of it. So you lose all of the spirit of your site when it's gone to AMP. So, okay, if that's what you want, go for it. And part of the reason Google wanted you to do this is because they're trying to fight against web slowness, which is a very noble goal in itself. Like, we have screwed up web performance terribly. That's a whole other conversation. But the websites of today generally are way slower than they need to be. And it's not trending well either. It's not looking like we're going to fix that problem. So maybe the approach to fixing that problem through forcing it is another approach, like, well, you're not going to fix this, so we'll dangle a carrot in front of you that says, if you do this instead, we'll fix the performance problem through this. And so the carrot that they dangled was like, it was kind of like an SEO carrot. It was like, if you do this, you're going to get a hell of a lot more web traffic, because we can do things for you. We can put you in, like, if you're a news website, we can put your news in the top carousel when you search for things on Google. And that's a hell of a carrot, That's like, whoa, we should do that. Our website will be fast. Our users will be happy with us because of our fast website. Google will be sending us more traffic. We have to go, So as far as I know, the conversations that happened on teams for websites were like that. It's like, this doesn't even feel optional necessarily. It feels like we have to do this because Google's kind of telling us we have to. And that was very controversial. It was like, screw you, I don't want to maintain 2 different versions of my website. Like, we went through that in the mobile days. These days most websites don't have a mobile team and a desktop team. That sucked for us. It was expensive. Things got out of sync. It was hard to hire properly and get people staffed across those 2 teams. And responsive web design comes along and says, you don't need to do that anymore. Let's get those code bases together. Most websites aren't, with an AMP site, you have to deliver an alternate version of that AMP site, and you need to style it different. You have to approach it technologically in a totally different way. We're back to that sucky place where you have to maintain 2 different versions of your site just for this, and that feels unfortunate to me. It also feels a little unfair that if I have a really fast website anyway, I happen to be someone that can make a fast website, that I'm locked out of using the good search engine placement from Google. That's not available to me, even though my website is just as fast or faster than an AMP site is. That seems sucky, that seems like a strong man move. Like, no, you're going to use our technology or get out. And they can do that because it's their world. They're an independent company. They can do whatever they want. It doesn't mean we have to like it. That's unfortunate. But there's this other interesting aspect to AMP that it isn't just technology only. It's not put your website in this format and now it's AMP. There's this thing called the AMP cache, which is a big deal to AMP too. And as part of the reason that they can be so fast is that, when you have an AMP site and Google sees it, they can put it in their, kind of global CDN, or they're willing to put it in their global CDN in a way that, let's say you search for some news result that shows up in that carousel, you click the carousel and it feels very instantaneous. It's kind of cool how fast it feels, but it's the AMP technology that enables that cache. And by not using AMP, that opts you out of that cache, which means they can't offer that experience, which is unfortunate. But if you kind of follow this story, it's interesting to see that it got a lot of, it's had both. It's had positive sentiment, like, thanks Google for saving us from ourselves, kind of thing. And then a lot of backlash being like, do not strong arm me into using this. Like, Google, you're using your muscle a little too powerfully here and influencing web kind of in a direction that kind of isn't fair and doesn't have a lot of oversight and feels just like a corporate overlord telling us what to do and kind of might be hurting the web ultimately. And they've definitely heard that feedback. And the latest news from this was that carousel up there that I'm talking about, where with the premium search engine results, they're backing off that being AMP only. So, or at least we're seeing Google seeing some feedback from this, saying that, like, maybe that wasn't fair, that wasn't a good move. We can reward sites that are fast anyway in that way. So it's just been interesting to follow. I am not compelled to make an AMP site yet personally. I know, for example, CSS-tricks is a WordPress site. I could just install a plugin and now it makes an AMP site. But then as soon as I do that, Google will pick up on that in the search engine results. So you'll Google for the Flexbox guide, and then instead of going to our nicely designed thing that's done very well for us, you'll get the AMP version of that, which will have no interesting styling on it at all, and will be, in my experience, kind of a terrible experience for that. Now, I could mess with the technology and figure out how to get it styled back to an acceptable place on the AMP side, but it just opens up this huge bucket of work for me that I didn't sign up for. I don't really want to do. You know what I mean?
I think you actually raise an interesting point insofar that I think the majority of implementations of AMP is people using, for example, WordPress plugins and so forth. Because I have landed on a couple of AMPs, like implementations of a site that is definitely very broken. And I kind of tried to figure out, I needed to figure out, okay, how do I get to the actual version, mobile version, without getting directed to the AMP version. So yeah, I think like that's also kind of a problem, is that people just add it as an afterthought.
And then you go to it and you're like, oh, interesting article. And then you look at the URL bar and it says http://google.com/ but it looks like you're on a Google site, which is weird. Then you share it to your friend. That URL is a Google URL, and it links up this AMP version of your site, but add a Google URL, and you're like, what is happening here? Are all websites owned by Google now? It just feels a little corporate overlord in a kind of unsafe way. And and even if they're like, oh, this is fine, we're doing this all the right way, I think it's still worthy of being like, can we just like be a little protective over the internet, please? This is kind of a big deal to us. This has been precarious all along. Let's be careful. I think that's how I feel about it. Like, let's be careful.
Yeah. So there's another question around whether you have any advice or like a rule of thumb for determining like what you want to support, kind of browser wise, specifically all the browsers. So like for polyfilling and prefixing, auto prefixing and those type of things. Do you, I know it's kind of a very broad question, but do you have any rules of thumb that you follow for determining that?
So determining what, like support?
Yeah, like what all the browsers do you want to support? Like how far back? Because obviously the more you support, like there is a cost, especially to people that actually support those features natively. Like how do you determine where to draw that line?
Yeah, well, I think it's not that hard of a thing to do. What you should do is measure it on your own site, because it's so like, this is a little pet peeve I have, is so many people they kind of like Google general browser usage across the entire internet, and they'll find some sources of like, how widely used is IE11 globally, and they'll come up with some number like 1.3% or something, and they'll be like, what is 1.3% worth to us? And if you're a big website, that number might be high enough in money that you're like, all it takes is for me to hire one developer whose job it is to make sure that the IE11 stuff works, and then we can make $1 million or whatever. Yeah, let's do that. That the economics of that work out okay. But that's like why that number is irrelevant. That's not the right number for your website. And any analytics tool I've ever seen is happy to tell you the percentage of browser usage on your site. So if you have pretty much any analytics installed, you'll be able to really quickly look at the usage of your website and what the usage of different browsers is there. So if you're trying to decide whether you're going to support IE11 or not, and I don't use that example as just any old example, that's like the main one that people are talking about right now. Nobody's like, should we support iOS, Safari on iOS? Yes, you should support Safari on iOS. You might have a discussion about how far back there you go, but it's like, it's getting less, I don't know, it's like there's starting to be less and less problems even in fairly old versions of that. I mean, it depends on what we're talking about, but generally the big browser support discussion is, should we hit IE11 or not? And if that's the only one you're talking about, just see what the number is for your website, not globally, and then run the numbers and see what's up, you know? Like I don't support IE11 on CSS-tricks or CodePen, and it's so extreme that we almost don't do hardly anything at all. I just like let it be broken. And it's because the usage is incredibly small. It's not 1.7%. It's probably an order of magnitude or two lower than that. It's just so few. And then you get, you know, so you can balance some of that with feedback too. I've never gotten an email that said, Chris, can you please fix up CSS-tricks for IE11? It's like, I've never gotten that email ever. You know, if I had, I would factor that into my kind of decision making on whether I would support that. But I know plenty of websites, particularly e-commerce and big website, internal websites with employees with older computers and stuff that have to support IE11, and it's just just a no-brainer for them. They just do it. They have to do it, so they do it. You know, it's part of the job.
I assume that CSS-tricks and Codepen also is more skewed to developers, so which tend to have like evergreen browsers. Like I would imagine my grandparents wouldn't visit CSS-tricks, for example. So yeah,
sure. And grandparents might have an older computer. It's likely that they would, because they're just not buying a computer every year because they don't care that much. It's kind of how things tend to fall. I mean, CSS-tricks is weird for other reasons. Like, yes, it's mostly developers, but it's mostly developers working on their desktop computer, because like the coding scene on phones and in even tablets isn't that strong, and you tend to not be on CSS-tricks just recreationally. I mean, some people, I hope so, you know, but it's just kind of if you're just into web news, you might read it on your phone. That's fine, but it's really low. Like, I think if you look at global statistics of desktop versus mobile, like internet traffic generally, I think we kind of crossed the precipice where it's like more than half of web traffic is a phone or tablet or, you know, a device like that. But on CSS-tricks, it's like 2% or something, like really literally that low, super low of like phone traffic on CSS-tricks. So it's not that I don't like have a responsive design. I don't use that to inform that, like, oh, that gets me out of having to make a small screen version of the site. But, you know, I definitely design it desktop first. I mean, that's the experience of 98% of the people visiting the site. You better believe I'm going to get that right first, you know?
Yeah, and I assume a lot of people like viewing it on mobile is maybe also doing it through things like Instapaper and Pocket and so forth, and not maybe even hitting the browser itself.
I don't have that statistics though, because analytics wouldn't report that necessarily.
Yeah. So there's another question here. What is your? A lot of people think I asked this one, but it's actually someone else because I'm a big fan of the JAMstack. But what is your general take on kind of the rising trend and kind of building JAMstack websites? Do you kind of think it's a fad, or do you think it's kind of heading somewhere?
Oh, it's definitely heading somewhere. That's the way to go. I think it should be kind of the default way that all websites are built, because it's not a very prescriptive thing. When you say that, you imply no particular technology. I think the only technology that you're implying when you say JAMstack is just that the pre-built assets are on some static site host that is a CDN, that is like a CDN backed static host, just so that all the pre-built files for that website are delivered very quickly. That's like the only thing that it means, and the rest of it is really up to you. Like, what's your build process going to be like? What tools you're going to use? Do you need APIs? Do you need backend stuff that's there and available to you for the site to operate? It's totally wide open, you know. So if it's just like your Jekyll blog and there's no JavaScript at all, and it's just all pre-built files and you ship it up to the CDN, that's JAMstack, absolutely, you know. Or is it your, you know, React powered dashboard site? Well, you pre-built the homepage, you pre-built a couple of pages because you're using like Next or something, you know. but then all the data of it comes from some data source that you hit, when your React components render or whatever. That's JAMstack too, as long as you're pre-building as much as you can and shipping the pre-built files, your bundles and your CSS and as much of the HTML as you can out to some global CDN static host thing. That's JAMstack too. Even though those are really feel like different things, it's like there's no web server sitting there for request for the web requests. You're still following that JAMstack philosophy. So it's like, because that's such a strong base philosophy, I'd say like really most of the web should like be headed in that direction. There's so many advantages to it.
Cool. So we have one more question, and then we can probably start ending off. And this one actually ties in neatly with your initial introduction around like how CSS-tricks and well, specifically CodePen, how it kind of came from scratching your own itch. And that is, are there any areas like in terms of web development needs of the day-to-day web developer that you feel are currently not being addressed in terms of like tools like CSS-tricks and so forth? I think another way to maybe phrase this question is like all of us are obviously bound by our capacity to actually work on X amount of personal projects. If you had time to do another project like CSS-tricks or CodePen or so forth, what kind of developer need do you think you would maybe think of addressing?
That's a good question. I mean, there's a lot that's like, what would I want to work on, and then what I think developers need. Yeah, I don't know. Like if you have like a really strong developer need idea, I feel like if I felt like it was strong enough, I'd be doing it already, because that's kind of the entrepreneurial spirit, like if you got a good idea and you think it's an underserved thing, like you should be on it, get on it, But I'm so busy with CodePen, and CodePen, is you may not think of it this way, but it's kind of JAMstack. It's kind of like, or at least has the opportunity to be more JAMstack-like. You build these files and then we store them on like essentially a static host and then serve up the results of that. I'd like to head more and more in that direction. I think the JAMstack thing is such a big deal. I think we can serve that market better. So that's kind of what I'm excited to work on. Personally, if I had more time, like if all these projects fell away and I was just like, I'm just gonna play around with building something else, I think I like to learn things that I don't already know, but then be able to leverage all the stuff that I do know while I'm doing it, And lately I've been like, I wonder if like what would it be like to actually build an app, like I've never built a native app for anything, but I'd like to like use as much web knowledge as I can to do it as well. So I have long been compelled by the like these technologies that allow you to use at least some of your web knowledge to ultimately build native apps. I think the most interesting one is Flutter right now. I don't know if y'all have seen that, but it's like Google's tool for you kind of write it once and then it can compile to an iOS app and a desktop app and Windows app, and it's kind of, but for real, like actually native versions of it, not just like a web wrapper kind of thing. And I've only played with it a little bit, and it's it's cumbersome and weird, and I struggle with things, but in that struggle, I almost feel good. Like I'm only struggling because I just don't get it yet. Like my muscle memory isn't there yet. Like this would be interesting to learn. And there's something appealing about that. If I struggled through it and I built the thing that I needed to build, then I can just I kind of essentially press the button and get all these native apps out of it that can ship to all these platforms. That's really cool, But it has me interested, but only in at the moment, because I'm so busy with other things, there's nothing I can do with that interest, I can't drop everything to learn this technology. It's not happening right now. But if my day is freed up dramatically, I would do it. I think I would. It's interesting to me.
Yeah, we specifically had a discussion, we were talking about JAMstack actually this morning, and someone mentioned Flutter, asking if you can build a JAMstack site with Flutter, and I think someone joked around saying it's the fam stack. And so I was
quite related. It's not, you're not shipping a website with static files. You're shipping like a compiled thing. It's just not the same universe.
Yeah, I think my response was actually it has less to do with the J and actually more to do with the M, so the markup part, and not necessarily the JavaScript part.
Yeah, I don't even know, like a Flutter shipped website. What is it? What goes to the browser? I don't even know exactly. I know it's kind of funky. Like I've seen some examples where you like go to select the text and it's like not even text, and you're like, that's not good. Is that good? That seems bad.
Yeah, for all you know, it's
Canvas API.
Yeah.
What's
to draw everything, I think.
Canvas?
What? Really?
Yeah.
Does it use a canvas? Whoa, that's some wild stuff.
Yeah, literally it uses Canvas to draw everything. To render
How is
everything.
accessibility handled at all then? Is it just not? Or
I can't imagine it being. But, yeah, I don't know. It's a strange world. But that being said, I don't see many web things being built in Flutter either. So it's maybe just like an
that's most
experimental thing. Yeah.
right.
So
It's
I was
cool,
actually mistaken. Yeah. We have one more question. Justin, do you maybe want to ask it and end us off?
Sure. So, Chris, in January 2019, you wrote an article you might remember called The Great Divide, where you posited that there were perhaps kind of two areas in front end that were diverging and not seeing each other. On the one side, a kind of JavaScript-oriented developer, and on the other, someone interested in UI and maybe a little bit of, light JavaScript rather than framework and so on. And that engendered a lot of debate. I know you kind of touched on this a little bit earlier when we were discussing CSS-in-JS, but do you think that divide is still a thing? Where do you think we stand now when we ask the question? And I know it's an enormous question, so what is a front-end developer?
I think I mean, if people aren't familiar with the article, you can go check it out. I feel like it stands up okay, but I almost kind of hope it doesn't. I kind of hope that it feels like a weird relic in time at some point, but not because the divide is solved or that we're all on the same side again, but that it's just a little bit more obvious what the kind of specialties are. And it's like, that was the beginning of the split of these specialties, but it's just more obvious now, and it's not kind of like not a big deal. But the capabilities of front end just exploded. Like the growth of JavaScript and the ways that we work on the web there's just more capability there, and there's more complexity there, and technology evolved to that point where there's just too much kind of for one person to know. It was obvious to people when of course, it's very difficult to be extremely good at back-end work and extremely good at front-end work. It wasn't expected of people. It wasn't people, you just kind of got it. You're like, oh, that's weird. It's like when you see somebody who's like this incredible guitar player and then they can play piano equally as well. It's like, yeah, there's people like that, but it's a little rare because they're very different instruments. So it's just kind of a rarity thing. Like not everybody has that kind of time. Not everybody's some weird savant in it. Well, that same thing is just moved to front end now. Like there's so much more that you can do on the front end, but because it's just called front end, that the expectations got all jacked up, that like just because you're a front end developer doesn't mean you can do all this stuff now. Like you're going to end up specializing in pieces of it because it's too much to become an expert at all of it. And so some of that stuff is like the world of React, for example. Like if you're super dug in there and you know the whole React system really well, and you know your Webpack, and you know your CSS and JS ecosystem, and GraphQL stuff and how to get data and how to write your schemas and how to write your mutations for the data and stuff. You're just like a particular kind of developer that's like good at that world. And it's often at the cost of some other stuff. Like maybe your knowledge of how SVG operates is a little limited, if you have any at all, because you just don't know that stuff, or that your knowledge of accessibility has suffered because you were busy studying other things and becoming great at other things and not that. It's kind of like a time in the day problem in a way. So the divide kind of manifested itself as an awful lot of people getting really, really good at JavaScript, and having people look at those people and be like, that's great. Good for you. We need those people. That's where tech is going. But it's been at the cost of learning some of this other kind of stuff. Like you just used a div for everything because it kind of worked visually, but it was at the cost of accessibility. Or you just npm installed your way out of 50 problems because it kind of worked for you, and it had a real cost on the performance of the particular website, and you just didn't know or didn't think about that because I don't know, you just didn't. You were busy thinking about other things, which is okay, but it means that you need to be balanced with this other skill set and this other skill set, and it hasn't shaken out yet, like it just needs a little time to kind of be figured out, like what are these roles called, how do we hire for them, and that. So it's complicated. There's just so much to talk about here, but I'm glad that article resonated with some people, because there's certainly people on kind of both sides. And that's what feels a little uncomfortable to me, is to have painted it as sides, is that these people are against each other, or that they don't care about each other, or anything like that, because it's just not really like that. It's just that people are feeling it. They're feeling I still have this deep skill set and feel but then I go to find a job and I can't find one because people are only hiring for people with 8 years of React Native experience or something. And you're like, what happens? What about my little role where I make WordPress sites and I've been doing it for 10 years? Like, I still am using technology to solve problems. So the job market confuses it as well,
Yeah.
So yeah, unfortunately, I'm going to have to scoot here, team, but I really appreciate the opportunity to chat.
Yeah, well, from our side, just thank you so much for giving up your time to speak with us. It was really great. I'm sure we all enjoyed it very much. It was very, very interesting. And yeah, thank you again for joining us. And thanks to everyone who spent this time with us. It was really, really illuminating for all of us. So thanks again.
I really appreciate it. Take care, everybody.
Cool. Cheers, Chris.
Cool. Bye.